When my daughter-in-law chose control over compassion, it didn't happen all at once. It arrived quietly, wrapped in polite smiles and carefully chosen words, the kind that sound helpful until you realize they're building a cage around you. I didn't notice the shift at first. I was too busy being grateful that my son still called, grateful that someone offered to drive me to appointments, grateful that meals showed up without me asking. I told myself this was what family looked like when you got older, softer, slower. I told myself I was lucky my son Michael had always been gentle with me. Even as a boy, he carried things instead of dragging them, spoke softly instead of shouting, apologized when he didn't need to. I raised him after his father left, working long hours, sleeping little, stretching every dollar until it screamed. I never taught him to dominate, I taught him to care. That's why, when he married Lauren, I believed her sweetness. She laughed easily, hugged tightly, and called me Mom from the very beginning. I thought I'd gained a daughter. The first time I felt the ground shift was small. Lauren insisted on handling my mail because, as she said, it was easier. She reorganized my kitchen because she worried I might trip reaching for things. She replaced my phone with one she said was simpler, bigger buttons, clearer screen. Every suggestion came with a smile and a reason, and every time I hesitated, Michael would squeeze my hand and say, "She's just trying to help." So I let it happen. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be the mother-in-law people whispered about. Control rarely announces itself. It disguises itself as concern. Soon, Lauren was scheduling my appointments without asking, speaking for me when doctors asked questions, answering before I could finish a sentence. When I corrected her, she laughed lightly and said, "You're adorable when you get feisty." Michael laughed too, not unkindly, but enough to make me feel foolish for pushing back. I started talking less, waiting longer, choosing silence over being corrected. Then came the day she said, I shouldn't live alone anymore. She said it casually, over soup, like she was commenting on the weather. "It's just not safe," she said, glancing at Michael. "She forgets things." I looked at my son, expecting him to object. Instead, he looked conflicted, tired, like this conversation had already happened without me. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I hadn't forgotten anything important. I paid my bills, I cooked my meals, I remembered birthdays, but doubt is contagious, and once planted, it grows fast. They began framing decisions as conclusions. "We've decided," Lauren would say. "We think it's best." My opinions became interruptions. My questions became resistance. The house I'd lived in for 30 years suddenly felt temporary, like a place I was borrowing until someone reclaimed it. I started noticing how Lauren watched me, not with hatred but with calculation. She wasn't cruel, she was efficient, and that was somehow worse. The night I realized compassion had fully left the room, Lauren sat across from me and spoke slowly, carefully, as if to a child. "You need structure," she said, "routine, boundaries." The word boundaries landed hard. Boundaries are what you set to protect yourself, not what others use to limit you. Michael avoided my eyes. In that moment, I understood that love alone doesn't protect you from being overruled. Silence, I realized, had trained them to believe I would accept anything. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of a house that no longer felt like mine. I wasn't angry yet. I was alert. There's a difference. Anger burns fast. Alertness sharpens slowly. I began replaying conversations, noticing patterns, recognizing how often my voice had been replaced. I saw clearly then that control had taken the driver's seat and compassion had been asked to step aside. What Lauren didn't know was that I had survived worse than her careful takeover. I had rebuilt my life once already. I had learned how to endure without disappearing, and as I lay there in the dark, a calm settled over me, steady and deliberate. If she wanted control, she was about to learn the cost of underestimating the woman she thought she was managing. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I stopped being polite about protecting it. I didn't announce the change. I didn't confront anyone or raise my voice. I simply started paying attention again, the way you do when you realize you've been walking through fog. I asked for copies of documents. I listened more than I spoke. I wrote things down. Lauren mistook my quiet for surrender, and Michael mistook it for peace. Neither understood that silence can be preparation. Each small choice I made was invisible to them, but it was returning weight to my feet, steadiness to my hands. I remembered who I was before I learned to make myself smaller for the comfort of others. I remembered the woman who balanced checkbooks at midnight, who fixed leaky faucets, who negotiated with life without asking permission. That woman hadn't vanished, she had been waiting, and as the house slept, I made myself a promise I would not break. No one would decide my ending but me. The realization didn't make me cruel, it made me precise. Compassion still lived in me, just no longer at my expense. I understood then that love without agency becomes a trap, and help without consent becomes control. I wasn't rejecting family, I was reclaiming myself. And once that line was drawn inside me, everything else would follow. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I would choose myself even if it surprised them, and that knowledge settled in my bones like truth. It felt permanent, unshakable, earned. Finally, unmistakably, mine. At last, fully so. The next morning, nothing looked different, but everything felt altered. Lauren poured coffee like always, humming softly, her movements precise. Michael scrolled through his phone at the table, nodding occasionally as she talked about plans I hadn't been asked about. I watched them the way you watch a play after you've figured out the ending, noticing cues, timing, the subtle way one person leads and the other follows. I realized then that Michael hadn't changed into someone cruel. He had changed into someone tired, someone who let the loudest voice make decisions so he wouldn't have to choose between the two women in his life. It didn't excuse him, but it explained him. Lauren asked if I slept well. I said yes. She smiled, satisfied, as if good sleep confirmed her authority. When she suggested reorganizing my bedroom later that week, I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I was done arguing from the position she had assigned me. Compliance can be camouflage. I had learned that long ago. That afternoon, while Lauren was out and Michael at work, I took out the old folder I kept hidden behind winter coats in the hall closet. Inside were documents I never threw away. Deeds, bank statements, insurance policies, notes written in my own careful handwriting from years ago. Lauren believed she had simplified my life. What she hadn't done was erase my memory. I spread everything across the bed and began sorting, not with panic, but with method. Each paper was a reminder that my life existed before her systems, before her color-coded binders and passwords I wasn't supposed to remember. I called the bank first, just to ask questions. I didn't accuse, I didn't demand. I asked what access I still had and what required my signature. The woman on the phone spoke to me normally, respectfully, and that alone felt like oxygen. I learned more in 10 minutes than Lauren had ever told me. Control thrives on confusion. Clarity weakens it. Over the next few days, I practiced speaking again, small things at first, correcting the time of an appointment, saying no to a suggestion without explanation, watching Lauren's eyes narrow just slightly when I didn't fill the silence with justification. She wasn't used to resistance that didn't announce itself. Michael noticed too, though he didn't comment. He watched me carefully, like he was trying to remember who I used to be. One evening, Lauren sat beside me and took my hand, her grip firm but rehearsed. She said she worried about my stress levels. She said all this conflict wasn't good for my health. I pulled my hand back gently and said, "Then stop creating it." The room went still. Michael looked up, startled. Lauren laughed, but it was thinner this time. She told me I was being sensitive. I told her I was being accurate. That was the first crack. Not dramatic, not loud, just a statement that refused to bend. I could feel the shift then, the way balance changes when someone realizes you're not as movable as they thought. Lauren doubled down after that. She started documenting things, writing notes on the fridge, sending messages to Michael while sitting in the same room. She framed every disagreement as concern. "I'm just worried about her," she'd say. But now I could hear the difference between worry and ownership. I began making my own appointments again. I arranged transportation. I told friends where I was living, something Lauren had subtly discouraged, saying it would confuse people. Confuse them about what? I wondered. About who was in charge. The more visible I became, the more unsettled she grew. Control, hates, witnesses. One afternoon, Michael came home early. He found me at the table with paperwork spread out, a pen in my hand. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was reviewing my affairs. He frowned and said Lauren had already taken care of most of that. I looked up at him and said, "No one takes care of my life but me." His face changed then, not anger, something like relief mixed with fear. He sat down heavily and asked why I was doing this now. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. I said I felt managed instead of loved. I said help without asking felt like erasure. He listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't for months. When Lauren came in and saw us talking quietly, she paused in the doorway. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The power dynamic had shifted, and she felt it. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because things were resolved, but because I had reclaimed something essential, my voice. I knew there would be consequences. People who choose control don't surrender it gracefully. But I also knew I was no longer alone inside my own mind, no longer questioning my reality just to keep the peace. Peace built on silence is fragile. I was building something sturdier now. The next day, Lauren confronted me directly. She said I was undermining her. I asked how. She said by questioning decisions. I told her decisions about my life were not hers to make. Her face hardened then, the warmth draining away. She warned me that pushing back would make things difficult. I smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just honestly, and said, "They already are." That was the moment compassion officially lost its seat. And I let it go. Not because I stopped caring, but because caring no longer meant surrender. I understood then that boundaries don't destroy families, control does, and whatever came next, I would meet it standing, not shrinking, not apologizing for existing. I had lived too long, given too much to disappear quietly now. I gathered my papers, stacked them neatly, and felt something solid settle in my chest. This was not rebellion, this was return. I was back in my own life and I wasn't leaving it again. Lauren didn't speak to me for 2 days after that, not directly. She spoke around me, over me, through Michael, as if I were a piece of furniture she hadn't decided where to place yet. It was a calculated silence, meant to make me uncomfortable, meant to punish me without appearing unkind. I recognized it immediately. I had used the same tactic once, years ago, on a supervisor who thought fear was leadership. It only works if the other person is still seeking approval. I wasn't. Michael tried to smooth things over. He always had. He brought me tea in the evenings, asked if I needed anything from the store, hovered in that familiar way that said he wanted peace more than truth. I didn't reject him, but I didn't rescue him either. I answered simply, kindly, without over-explaining. Each time I did, I could see him recalibrating, realizing that neutrality was no longer enough. On the 3rd day, Lauren announced she had scheduled an evaluation. She said it casually, as if it were a dentist appointment. "Just to put everyone's mind at ease," she said. I asked what kind of evaluation. She said cognitive. I asked who requested it. She said she had. I asked if I had agreed. She paused, just a second too long, then said it was for my own good. That was when I stood up, slowly, calmly. I told her no. One word, clear. She told me I was being unreasonable. I told her she was overstepping. Michael looked between us, panic rising, and said we should all talk about it. I told him there was nothing to discuss. My medical care was not a group decision. Lauren's voice sharpened then. She said if I refused it would raise concerns. I asked whose. She said professionals. I asked which ones. She had no answer. Control depends on vagueness. Precision dismantles it. I called my doctor myself that afternoon, explained the situation, asked for documentation. He knew me, had for years. He listened. He agreed to see me, alone. When I returned home with a printed summary stating I was fully competent, Lauren barely glanced at it. Facts don't matter to people who need the story to go a certain way. That evening, I called my friend Helen. We'd known each other since our children were toddlers. Lauren had once suggested Helen was a bad influence, said she filled my head with ideas. I laughed when Helen answered the phone, a real laugh, the kind that comes from being seen. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question my memory. She said, "Come stay with me if you need to." Just like that. No conditions, no control. The next morning, I packed a small bag, not dramatically, just enough for a few days. When Lauren saw it by the door, her composure cracked. She asked where I thought I was going. I said I was visiting a friend. She said I couldn't just leave. I asked why not. She said because it wasn't safe. I picked up my keys and said I'd been leaving houses longer than she'd been alive. Michael followed me outside. He asked me not to do this. I asked him what this was. He couldn't answer. I told him I loved him, that I wasn't disappearing, that I just needed space where my voice wasn't debated. He hugged me tightly, longer than usual, and I felt something like grief in his arms. Not for me. For the role he'd played in letting this happen. Helen's house smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. It felt like freedom. Over tea, we talked strategy, not revenge, strategy. I contacted a lawyer that afternoon, recommended by a woman at church who'd gone through something similar. I explained everything. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and told me something I already suspected. You have more power here than you think. We reviewed documents. We reviewed my rights. We discussed contingencies. Lauren's name was nowhere it shouldn't be, but the attempt mattered. Attempt reveals intent, and intent leaves a trail. When I returned to Michael's house 2 days later, I was different, not hardened, clarified. Lauren greeted me with forced brightness. I greeted her politely. Nothing more. She watched me closely now, measuring, recalculating. Control doesn't like uncertainty. A week passed, then another. The house existed in a strange truce. Lauren stopped making decisions for me, but she watched every move. Michael walked on eggshells, and I quietly prepared. I updated documents. I rerouted mail. I made copies. I told people where I was and what was happening. Control thrives in isolation. I dismantled it with connection. One night, Lauren finally confronted me. She said I was tearing the family apart. I asked how. She said by not trusting her. I said trust is built, not demanded. She accused me of manipulating Michael. I said I had raised him to think for himself, and if that scared her, she should ask why. She told me I was selfish. I told her I had earned the right to be. Michael asked us to stop. I told him this was the stopping, that I would no longer accept decisions made about me, that if they wanted a relationship with me, it would be as an equal, not a dependent. He nodded slowly, like something painful but necessary was settling in. That night, alone in my room, I felt the weight of everything I'd carried finally shift. This wasn't victory yet, but it was alignment. My actions matched my truth, and once that happens, the rest is only a matter of time. I slept peacefully, knowing that whatever came next, it would meet a woman who remembered exactly who she was. The tension in the house became a kind of background noise, like a clock you stop noticing until it suddenly stops ticking. Lauren adjusted her behavior, but not her intent. She stopped issuing instructions and started asking questions that weren't really questions at all. You don't mind if I handle this, do you? You're okay with me taking care of that, right? Each sentence was framed to make refusal sound rude. I learned to answer calmly, without apology. I'll take care of it myself. No, thank you. Simple sentences, powerful ones. Michael struggled the most. I could see it in the way his shoulders stayed tense, in the way he lingered in doorways. He wanted harmony, but he didn't understand yet that harmony built on imbalance always collapses. One evening, he asked me quietly if I was planning to leave for good. The fear in his voice nearly broke me. I told him no. I told him I wasn't leaving him. I was leaving the version of myself that disappeared to make things easier for others. He nodded, but I don't think he fully understood yet. Lauren, however, understood perfectly. She began tightening her grip in subtler ways. Bills arrived late. Appointments were forgotten. Small inconveniences that could be explained away, each one designed to remind me how much smoother things were when she was in charge. I corrected each one calmly, paid the bill, rescheduled the appointment. Every fix weakened her narrative that I couldn't manage on my own. The real turning point came the afternoon I received a call from my insurance company. They asked to confirm a change of address. I hadn't requested one. When I said so, there was a pause. Then the representative read out Lauren's name. That was the moment. Not anger, not shock, clarity. I thanked the representative, corrected the information, and asked for a full record of recent changes. When I hung up, my hands were steady. That evening, I asked Lauren to sit down with me. Michael joined us, wary. I placed the printed records on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I asked one question. Why did you try to redirect my insurance mail? Lauren stared at the papers, then at Michael. She said she was trying to help. I asked how rerouting my private information without consent was help. She said she thought I'd agreed. I asked when. She couldn't answer. Michael finally spoke. His voice shook. Lauren, did you do this? She snapped back that he was choosing sides. He said quietly that he was choosing truth. That was the first time I'd seen him stand up to her without looking at me for reassurance. Something shifted then, not loudly, fundamentally. Lauren accused me of poisoning him against her. I told her I hadn't needed to. Actions speak loudly when you stop covering for them. She stood abruptly, said she wouldn't be interrogated in her own home, and left the room. The door slammed. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Michael stayed. He stared at the table for a long time. Then he said, I didn't know. I told him I believed that. I also told him that not knowing doesn't erase responsibility. He nodded, eyes wet. He asked what I wanted. I told him the truth. Space, autonomy, respect, not permission. He said he didn't know if Lauren could accept that. I said then he would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. That night, Lauren didn't come to bed. The house felt heavy with unsaid things. I slept anyway, deeply, because I had crossed an internal line I would never uncross. I was no longer negotiating my humanity. The following weeks were strained. Lauren alternated between icy politeness and emotional appeals. She cried, she accused, she reframed. I stayed steady. Michael began spending more time talking to me, asking questions about my life before her, about choices I'd made. He was seeing me again, not as a responsibility, but as a person. One afternoon, he asked if I would consider moving out, not as an exile, but as an option. He said he thought it might help everyone reset. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said yes. Not because I was pushed out, because I was ready to choose where I lived. There's a difference. Lauren looked relieved when she heard. Too relieved. That told me everything. We discussed timelines. I told them I'd handle my own arrangements. Lauren offered to help. I declined. She didn't argue. I found a small apartment not far away. Bright windows, quiet neighbors, a place that felt like a beginning, not a retreat. When I signed the lease, my hand shook slightly. Not from fear, from recognition. This was mine. On my last night in the house, Michael hugged me tightly. He apologized, not with excuses, with awareness. I accepted it, knowing apology is only the first step. Lauren hugged me too, briefly, carefully. Her eyes searched my face, looking for something. I gave her nothing but politeness. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a surprising lightness. Control had tried to shrink my world. I had expanded it instead. I didn't know what would become of their marriage. That was not my burden to carry. I knew only this. Compassion without respect is not kindness, and choosing myself was not abandonment. It was survival. The apartment took time to sound like home. At first, every noise startled me. The hum of unfamiliar plumbing, footsteps in the hallway, the distant bark of a dog I didn't know. But there was something steady in that unfamiliarity. No one here watched me. No one monitored my movements or corrected my choices. The quiet wasn't strategic. It was simply quiet. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, placing each object as if reminding myself that I had agency again. This shelf, that drawer, my decisions. Michael called the second night. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. He sounded relieved, but also unsure, like a man learning new footing. We talked about small things, the weather, the drive to work, what I'd cooked for dinner. He didn't mention Lauren. I didn't ask. Silence, I had learned, can be a boundary too. Lauren didn't call at all. Instead, she sent a message 2 days later. It was long, carefully worded. She said she hoped I was settling in. She said she'd always wanted what was best for me. She said she felt misunderstood. I read it once, then again. Then I put the phone down and didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I was done engaging in conversations designed to reframe reality. Closure does not require participation. The weeks passed, and something unexpected happened. I felt stronger, not in a dramatic way, in a functional way. I woke up early, walked to the corner cafe, learned the names of the baristas. I joined a book club at the library. I reconnected with friends Lauren had quietly discouraged me from seeing. Each small act stitched me back into myself. One afternoon, Michael showed up unannounced. He looked tired, thinner. We sat at my small kitchen table, knees almost touching. He told me things weren't going well, that Lauren said I'd undermined her authority, that she felt betrayed. I listened without interrupting, then I said something I'd never said before. Her authority over what? He didn't answer. He couldn't. He asked if I would talk to her, mediate, help smooth things over. I looked at my hands, then back at him. I told him no. I told him that stepping back into that triangle would undo everything I'd fought to reclaim. He looked hurt. I told him I loved him. That love didn't mean self-erasure. He nodded slowly, absorbing something he should have learned long ago. A month later, Lauren called. Her voice was strained, the confidence gone. She asked if we could meet, just the two of us. I considered it carefully, not from fear, from choice. I agreed, but on my terms, a public place, coffee, no rewriting the past. She arrived late, sat down stiffly. She didn't smile. She said she felt like the villain in my story. I told her stories don't need villains, they need accountability. She said she'd only wanted to protect Michael. I asked who protected me. She had no answer. She accused me of breaking up her marriage. I told her I hadn't controlled Michael's choices. She had. She said I never liked her. I told her I'd welcomed her until she decided I was an obstacle. The truth landed hard between us. She looked away, jaw tight. She said she didn't know how things got so far. I told her control rarely feels wrong to the person holding it. We finished our coffee in silence. When we stood, she asked if I thought we could ever have a relationship again. I told her honestly, only if it was built on mutual respect, not hierarchy. She nodded, but I could see she didn't know how to do that yet. Not long after, Michael called with news he didn't quite know how to share. Lauren had suggested therapy, couples therapy, individual therapy. He sounded hopeful, cautious. I told him I was glad. Healing takes work, and sometimes loss is the invitation. Months passed. Seasons shifted. I filled my apartment with plants, with light, with laughter. I hosted dinners. I volunteered at the community center. I spoke to other women who whispered their stories like confessions, afraid they were ungrateful for wanting autonomy. I told them what I had learned. Gratitude is not obedience. Love is not control. Michael visited often. Our relationship changed, deepened. He listened more, asked less of me, gave more of himself. We talked honestly now about mistakes, about fear, about what happens when you don't confront things early. Lauren came once, polite, reserved, different. I could tell she was trying. I didn't rush forgiveness. Trust grows at its own pace. One evening, alone in my apartment, I realized something profound. I no longer felt the need to prove anything, not to Lauren, not to Michael, not even to myself. I had chosen compassion for myself when others chose control, and that choice had changed the trajectory of my life. I sat by the window, watching the city settle into night, and felt a deep, steady peace, not the kind that comes from everything being fixed, the kind that comes from knowing you will never abandon yourself again. Whatever came next, I would meet it whole, unmanaged, unapologetic, free. Life continued, not in dramatic bursts, but in a quiet rhythm I hadn't known I needed. Mornings began with sunlight spilling over the balcony, the faint scent of coffee from the cafe downstairs. I started journaling again, something I had abandoned years ago, letting the words pour onto paper without editing, without judgment. Each entry reminded me that my thoughts, my feelings, my existence had intrinsic value, not contingent on anyone else's approval. I reconnected with old friends, the ones who had noticed my gradual withdrawal and quietly checked in when Lauren's influence had slowly closed my world. Rebuilding those bonds wasn't immediate or flawless, but it was real. We shared laughter over tea, memories that had felt distant now vivid again, and small adventures, museum trips, weekend hikes, even a spontaneous visit to a small-town fair. These experiences, ordinary yet profound, became proof of the life I could claim for myself, separate from the invisible chains Lauren had tried to tighten. Michael visited more frequently now, though our interactions were different. No tense subtext, no unspoken loyalty tests. He would arrive with a tired smile, sometimes bringing groceries or books, and sit with me in silence. The silence was no longer threatening, it was comfortable. We had conversations about the mundane and the meaningful, about choices and regrets, about who we had been and who we were becoming. I realized that love, untainted by control, could feel like this, simple, steady, and sustaining. Then came an unexpected invitation. Lauren asked if I would attend Michael's birthday dinner with her and the family. I paused. Old instincts whispered caution, wariness, fear, but I listened to something deeper. Curiosity and self-respect. I agreed, with conditions. I would attend only on my terms, without compromising boundaries I had fought to reclaim. The evening arrived. The restaurant was warm, softly lit, a space neutral enough to ease tension. Michael greeted me with a smile that conveyed gratitude, relief, and a quiet understanding of my journey. Lauren approached cautiously, offering a polite nod, and I returned it, feeling neither warmth nor hostility, just acknowledgement. It was strange, this emotional equilibrium. I had imagined confrontation, tears, or anger, but instead, the air was calm. Mutual respect, it turned out, had its own power. The dinner progressed with polite conversation. Lauren made small attempts to explain her perspective, the controlling impulses, her fears for Michael. I listened. When it was my turn, I spoke honestly, calmly, without accusation. I explained how her choices had affected me, how control had overshadowed compassion, and how autonomy had become my lifeline. She nodded, occasionally shifting uncomfortably, but she listened, truly listened. By the end of the night, something subtle had shifted. No apologies had been dramatic, no reconciliations forced. But there was acknowledgement. There was an understanding that the past could not be erased, but could serve as a foundation for a new dynamic. I left the restaurant not triumphant or vindicated, but grounded, steady, and whole. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes in myself. Decisions I once hesitated to make now came easily. I felt more confident in asserting my preferences, whether in my apartment, my social interactions, or even in my conversations with Michael. The lingering fear that my desires would be dismissed was no longer present. It had been replaced by a quiet certainty. I would not surrender my autonomy for anyone, not out of fear, not out of obligation. One afternoon, while volunteering at the community center, a young woman approached me. She had the same cautious look I remembered seeing in myself years ago, an almost invisible plea for guidance. She shared her story, a mirror of my own experience, though shaped by different circumstances. I listened, then spoke gently but firmly. I told her what I had learned. Boundaries are not walls, they are protection. Compassion must be mutual, and control is never love. I watched as her shoulders relaxed, the weight of guilt and obligation slowly lifting. Sharing my experience, I realized, was a form of continued healing. Not just for me, but for others who had been silenced. Michael and I continued to navigate our relationship carefully. We shared plans, dreams, disappointments, and achievements. There were moments of old friction, flashes of past misunderstandings, but the difference now was our awareness. We addressed issues without blame, focusing on shared solutions rather than power dynamics. The love that had once been complicated by control now felt liberating, supportive, and expansive. Then came an unexpected turning point. Lauren reached out again, this time with a request to join a family gathering, not at Michael's request, but hers. She was seeking guidance, she said, on how to navigate her own patterns of control and rebuild her relationships. I considered this. I thought of the pain she had caused and the years spent under her manipulation. But I also remembered the empathy that had once drawn me to her, the understanding that even flawed people can grow. I agreed, cautiously. The gathering was tentative at first. Lauren appeared different, less guarded, more willing to listen. Michael, steady and patient, facilitated moments of dialogue that allowed honesty to emerge without blame. I participated, not as a victim, but as someone who had survived, learned, and grown. The dynamic shifted subtly. Control was no longer the invisible third guest. Accountability and compassion had replaced it. As months rolled into a year, I reflected on the transformation that had taken place. My relationship with Michael had matured, grounded in mutual respect. Lauren had begun therapy, her efforts visible in her tone, her gestures, her openness. And I, more than anything, had learned that true compassion begins with oneself. One cannot extend genuine care to others without first honoring one's own autonomy, needs, and boundaries. I had once felt trapped by the choices of others, by manipulation and control disguised as care. Now I was free, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. I was no longer the person who would defer, hide, or erase herself to appease someone else. I was whole, complete. And in that wholeness, I discovered not only freedom but a new capacity for love, deliberate, conscious, and unbound by coercion. The life I had reclaimed was a testament to resilience, courage, and clarity. It was quiet, yes, but profoundly alive. In choosing compassion for myself over enduring control, I had forged a life that was real, authentic, and unapologetically mine. The daughter-in-law who once sought dominance had become a reflection of the choices I would never allow to define me again. And in that reflection, I finally understood. Strength does not demand submission, love does not demand sacrifice, and peace is born from claiming your own voice, fully and without compromise. With the foundation of my new life settling firmly beneath me, I found myself reflecting on the subtler lessons the past months had taught me. It wasn't just about standing up to Lauren or reclaiming my space, it was about understanding the patterns that had allowed control to infiltrate my life in the first place. Control, I realized, often disguises itself as care, a well-meaning gesture, a persistent insistence, a helpful suggestion. They can all slowly erode autonomy if one isn't vigilant. For years, I had mistaken these impulses for love, for concern, never recognizing the way they silently chipped away at my confidence. I began documenting these patterns in my journal, not as a list of grievances, but as a blueprint for self-preservation and growth. I noted moments where I had hesitated to speak, times when I had muted my desires to avoid conflict, and instances where I had doubted my intuition in favor of someone else's preferences. Writing these things down was not cathartic in a fleeting sense. It was revelatory. I started seeing how subtle manipulations could take root in even the most intimate relationships, often under the guise of familial care or marital concern. One afternoon, as I reviewed an entry detailing a particularly hurtful interaction with Lauren, Michael walked in. He didn't announce himself, just leaned against the doorway, observing the concentration on my face. "You look different," he said softly. There was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity. I smiled faintly. "I feel different," I admitted. "It's like I've been asleep for years and just woke up." He nodded thoughtfully. "It's good to see you like this, strong, clear, you've earned it." His words, simple as they were, struck a chord. I realized that validation from others, especially those who had once been intermediaries in tension, was no longer necessary for me to feel whole. Yet it was profoundly rewarding when it came naturally. It was a reminder that strength and compassion are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist, creating relationships that are both nurturing and empowering. The community center remained a significant part of my life. Sharing my story, guiding others through similar struggles became a mission in itself. There was a particular young woman, Sana, who reminded me of my earlier self, hesitant, quiet, self-doubting. Over several weeks, she opened up about her experiences with an overbearing family member, the suffocating rules, the constant second-guessing of her choices. Listening to her, I felt a surge of empathy. I shared my journey, not as a tale of triumph over Lauren specifically, but as a broader narrative about reclaiming agency, recognizing manipulative patterns, and embracing self-compassion. Sana's eyes brightened with understanding, and I could see the relief of realization washing over her. She was beginning to reclaim her voice. Teaching, guiding, and witnessing such transformations reinforced my belief that personal growth is rarely solitary. It often blooms in connection, in shared experience, in empathy-turned action. Meanwhile, my interactions with Lauren remained cautiously neutral, though less tense with each passing encounter. She had started showing subtle signs of change, asking questions rather than issuing directives, pausing to listen rather than immediately correcting, and even expressing small acknowledgements of her past behavior. It wasn't perfect, and I didn't expect perfection. Transformation takes time, often longer than the initial pain that sparked it. But observing these shifts, I felt neither vindictive satisfaction nor lingering resentment. Instead, there was cautious hope, a recognition that even those who once caused harm are capable of reflection and growth. I also began exploring creative outlets that I had long neglected. Painting became a daily ritual, a way to express emotions that words sometimes failed to capture. My apartment gradually transformed into a space that reflected my identity, warm, inviting, yet unapologetically mine. Colors, textures, and shapes filled the rooms, each brushstroke a testament to autonomy reclaimed. Every canvas was a silent affirmation. I had survived, I had grown, and I was no longer living under the shadow of someone else's expectations. Michael often joined me during these sessions, quietly observing or occasionally adding his own touches to a canvas. Our connection deepened in these moments of shared creativity. There was no need for conversation. The silence was rich, the understanding profound. Love, I realized, could manifest in these subtle ways, through shared presence, through respect for each other's space, through mutual acknowledgement without domination or control. One evening, as I reflected on the past year, I realized how far I had come. I no longer felt the constant anxiety that had once defined interactions with Lauren. My self-worth was no longer tied to her perception of me, nor was it contingent on approval from any family member. I had learned that peace is not granted by others. It is claimed, nurtured, and fiercely protected. And yet, life continued to offer challenges. There were days when old insecurities crept back, when self-doubt whispered, when fear of judgment loomed. But now, I met these moments with awareness and strategy. I acknowledged the feelings without letting them dictate my choices. I spoke up when necessary, retreated when appropriate, and always returned to the principle that my voice mattered. The past had taught me that silence could be dangerous, that compliance could erode identity, and that subtle control could wound deeper than overt aggression. My vigilance had become a form of self-care, a protective embrace around the life I had rebuilt. Lauren eventually reached a point where she sought advice on her own behavioral patterns. She asked if I would recommend professional support, and I did, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because growth, when authentic, often requires external guidance. She agreed to therapy, and while I didn't become her counselor, I acknowledged her steps toward accountability. There was no reconciliation demanded, no expectation of warmth beyond mutual civility. It was enough that she had recognized the need to change. Michael and I too faced moments of friction, not dramatic battles, but everyday negotiations about time, priorities, and boundaries. These were different from past conflicts. They were opportunities for dialogue rather than arenas for control. Our disagreements were approached with curiosity rather than hostility, solutions-oriented rather than punitive. I realized that the healthiest relationships are those in which autonomy is respected, communication is transparent, and love is generous without being possessive. By the time another year passed, I had established a rhythm that was deeply satisfying. Work, social life, creative pursuits, volunteering, and family interactions coexisted harmoniously. My mental and emotional health had stabilized, anchored in principles of self-respect and discernment. I no longer measured my actions against others' expectations, but against my own values. The liberation was profound, not explosive, not flashy, but steady and enduring. Through it all, I held on to one truth: control cannot replace compassion. Attempts to dominate, even under the guise of care, are inherently corrosive. Real influence comes from understanding, empathy, and support. Real respect comes from honoring boundaries, listening actively, and allowing individuals to exercise their agency. Lauren's journey, Michael's presence, and my own reclamation of self served as living proof of this principle. Life had a quieter, steadier rhythm now, one that allowed me to savor small victories without the constant tension that had once shadowed every interaction. Each morning, I woke with a sense of clarity and purpose that was new and exhilarating. The anxiety that had once gripped me like a vice when Lauren entered a room or voiced her opinions had loosened its hold. I had learned that self-respect wasn't negotiable. It wasn't something to be borrowed from others or earned through compliance. It was intrinsic, cultivated through awareness, courage, and consistent action. I began hosting small gatherings in my apartment, inviting friends, colleagues, and neighbors, people who uplifted me rather than drained me. These gatherings were simple: shared meals, laughter, conversations about books, dreams, or everyday happenings. There were no hidden agendas, no undercurrents of judgment, just genuine connection. I noticed how different it felt to interact in this environment. There was no need to hedge my words, no need to preempt criticism, no lingering fear of control. The contrast with past family gatherings, where every phrase had been carefully measured, was striking. It was a revelation. Relationships flourish not under domination, but under mutual respect and authenticity. One evening, as I cleared the dishes from one such gathering, Michael came over and stood beside me, silently observing. "You've created something beautiful here," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. I paused, letting the compliment sink in. "It feels peaceful," I admitted. I didn't realize how much tension had become normal until now. He nodded, understanding without needing elaboration. Michael had a gift for noticing subtleties, for seeing the layers beneath surface behavior. His presence had been a balm during the earlier storms with Lauren, a constant reminder that not all relationships were arenas for control. Some could be spaces of growth, respect, and mutual support. Around this time, my reflections took a deeper, almost philosophical turn. I began considering the patterns of human behavior that allowed control to thrive. It wasn't just Lauren or my family, it was societal as well. There were unspoken rules, expectations, and norms that subtly dictated behavior, particularly for women in traditional family structures. Over decades, I had internalized these rules, believing compliance equaled harmony, that deference equaled love. Recognizing these patterns felt like stepping out of a shadow I hadn't even realized I was living in. I started reading extensively, books on psychology, behavioral science, and personal empowerment. I attended workshops on conflict resolution, communication, and emotional intelligence. Each insight was like a tool, equipping me to navigate relationships more skillfully, to recognize when influence crossed the line into control, and to respond with assertiveness rather than fear. I realized that personal growth wasn't just reactive, it was proactive. It required intention, reflection, and deliberate practice. One particularly memorable workshop focused on boundary setting. The facilitator spoke about the difference between compassion and control, emphasizing that true empathy doesn't coerce or manipulate. The concept resonated deeply. I reflected on past interactions with Lauren, the times she had masked control as care, the subtle ways she had imposed her preferences, and my own acquiescence. I realized that my earlier silence had been a form of permission, however unintended. Recognizing this wasn't about blame, it was about understanding the mechanisms that allowed patterns to persist. Inspired, I began applying these principles in daily life. I communicated more openly, expressing needs and expectations with clarity and calm. I practiced saying no without guilt and asking for what I wanted without apology. I observed how people responded, not with hostility, but often with respect once they understood my perspective. It was empowering to realize that authenticity could coexist with kindness, that boundaries didn't have to fracture relationships but could strengthen them. Michael became a crucial ally in this practice. We developed a rhythm of checking in with each other, discussing challenges without judgment, and celebrating progress. The intimacy we shared was built on mutual respect, emotional honesty, and the understanding that control has no place in love. Arguments, when they arose, were met with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Solutions were negotiated rather than dictated. Through this, I learned that a healthy partnership doesn't stifle individuality, but amplifies it. Meanwhile, Lauren's behavior remained a delicate matter. She oscillated between moments of reflection and subtle attempts to assert dominance. I learned to navigate these interactions with a blend of firmness and composure. When she tried to dictate actions or criticize, I responded calmly, stating my perspective without defensiveness. When she showed openness, I acknowledged it without judgment. The result was a gradual recalibration of our relationship, less tension, more respect, fewer moments of silent resentment. I understood that changing someone else's behavior entirely was beyond my control. What I could control was my response, my boundaries, and my emotional investment. At the community center, my work with young women like Sana expanded. I started organizing small workshops, focusing on self-awareness, communication, and recognizing unhealthy dynamics. Watching participants gain confidence, speak up, and assert themselves was profoundly fulfilling. I realized that my own journey, painful and complex as it had become a source of guidance and inspiration for others. There was a sense of purpose in translating personal struggle into collective growth, in turning adversity into empowerment. During one particularly intense session, a young woman shared a story that mirrored some of my own experiences with Lauren. The room fell silent as she described feeling invisible, unheard, and manipulated by someone she was supposed to trust. I listened, heart heavy, and then shared my own approach, setting boundaries, seeking support, cultivating self-respect, and practicing assertive communication. Her relief was palpable, and I felt a profound sense of connection, realizing that the pain of control could be transformed into strength when acknowledged and addressed consciously. Outside of these efforts, my personal life flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. I pursued creative projects, took weekend trips, and explored hobbies I had abandoned in the past. Each experience reinforced the truth that autonomy and fulfillment are inseparable. One cannot truly thrive while living under someone else's dictates. The lessons learned from my interactions with Lauren had equipped me with discernment, patience, and resilience, qualities that enhanced every aspect of my life. By now, I had a clearer understanding of compassion's true nature. It isn't about enabling or sacrificing oneself to placate others. True compassion respects autonomy, encourages growth, and provides support without imposing restrictions. Reflecting on my past interactions with Lauren, I saw how misguided compassion, mixed with control, can create resentment, fear, and distance. Understanding this principle reshaped my approach to every relationship, from family to friendship to romantic partnerships. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, nor was it without setbacks. There were moments of doubt, days when old patterns whispered seductively, tempting me to revert to silence or compliance. But each time, I consciously chose a different path, speaking my truth, asserting my boundaries, honoring my needs. Over time, these choices compounded, creating a life defined by clarity, respect, and authentic connection. Through all this, one realization stood out most vividly. Control is never a substitute for love. Attempts to dominate, manipulate, or dictate, even under the guise of care, inevitably undermine trust and erode emotional bonds. Love that seeks to control is not love. It is insecurity masquerading as affection. This understanding became my guiding principle, shaping every interaction and decision, reminding me that compassion without boundaries is hollow, and boundaries without compassion are cold. As I reflect on the journey, I realize that the most profound transformation was within me, not around me. The experiences with Lauren, painful as they were, became a catalyst for self-discovery, resilience, and empowerment. I no longer measure relationships by control, compliance, or fear, but by mutual respect, trust, and authenticity. Every interaction now carries a sense of intentionality, a choice to engage fully without compromising my values or sense of self. I recently had a conversation with Michael about all of this. We sat quietly on the balcony, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and he said, "You've built a life that reflects who you really are. It's not about avoiding conflict, it's about choosing what deserves your energy." His words struck me deeply. It was a reminder that peace and fulfillment are not found in avoidance or silence, but in conscious action, in aligning daily decisions with one's principles. Even my relationship with Lauren has subtly shifted. By holding firm to my boundaries, yet responding with calm and fairness, I've noticed a begrudging respect in her demeanor. She is still her complex self, but the constant tension has lessened. I understand now that change in others is never guaranteed. The only change I can truly cultivate is within myself. That insight is liberating. I've also embraced the broader implications of this journey. I mentor, I share, I guide, not to control or instruct, but to empower. I have seen firsthand how cycles of control can silently pass from one generation to the next, and I feel a responsibility to break that pattern. True compassion is a gift that nurtures freedom, choice, and dignity. It cannot thrive where domination reigns. Looking back, I see a path marked by struggle, introspection, and growth. Each challenge, each moment of tension with Lauren, each pang of self-doubt was part of the process. They were not obstacles but lessons, necessary, uncomfortable, and ultimately liberating. They taught me the power of voice, the importance of boundaries, and the truth that love is never measured by control, but by respect, care, and authenticity. Now my life is richer, not because it is free of conflict, but because I approach every interaction with awareness, courage, and empathy. I no longer shrink to accommodate the insecurities of others. I expand to embrace the fullness of who I am. And in doing so, I have discovered a peace that is steady, profound, and unshakable. This is not the life I expected when faced with control disguised as care, but it is the life I have deliberately created, and it is beautiful in its truth.